Hi, my name is Brett, and this is Test-Driven RSpec episode 4. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into unit testing models. We're going to start by creating a console model, which is derived from previous episodes where we just had a simple hash object. We're going to test methods on that model, test scopes, and test validations. In the last episode, we configured RSpec, so this episode is picking up right where we left off. Just to review the past code, we had a controller called consoles controller that returned an array of hash objects. And those hash objects aren't too friendly, they're not dynamic, and we're just going to work on making them a model because that's a pretty normal Rails thing to do. So the first thing we're going to do is create our model and generate the migration. So we're going to do Rails, bin Rails G for generate migration. And we're going to call this create consoles. We're going to stick with those two simple attributes of name and manufacturer, which are both strings. And we're going to run it. So that'll generate it. We'll open that up, which is our first migration. It creates consoles with the name and the manufacturer, and we're going to make some slight modifications to this migration. We're going to add timestamps. And we're going to make sure that name is never null, so it's always required. We're also going to make sure that manufacturer is always present, so we're going to do no false. If you've ever written model validations, which we're going to write too, this is sort of like a more in-depth model validation where it's saying at the database level, don't even allow null data. So usually you want to have your database validation here and then your model validation. So we'll dive into that more. That should be enough to get us started. And we can always add more attributes in the future, but let's run that migration and see if it works. Okay, great, that worked. Let's go ahead and open our DB schema. Great, everything is there as we expected. We're going to also do bin rake db test prepare, which will prepare our test database. Let's go ahead and run the test suite just to see if everything is working. Great, our old tests are passing. That's good. None of them interact with the database yet, but that's okay. We're just, it's good to check in and make sure we didn't break anything yet. Next step is to actually create that model. You could use a generator for the model, but I tend to like to just write them from scratch because I know exactly what I'm getting into, and it's just a nice way to know what Rails is doing without the generator magic. So that will be called console.rb. And I'd actually like to first start by writing our tests because we're going to be doing test-driven development. So in our spec directory, we don't have a models directory. So the first thing we're going to need to do is do make dir spec models. That'll create our models directory. We'll create that file for the console, which will be called console spec rb. For this, we require Rails helper because we're going to be testing a Rails model, so we'll need active model, which is all part of Rails. Start with our rspec.describe console. And I'd say for our first test, let's work on adding a validation for the name being present and the manufacturer being present. So since validations aren't technically methods, the ones that are baked in, like the presence validators, I do a describe for validations, and then I'll describe within that describe each validation attribute. So for this, we'll do name, and we'll say it is required, or it is required. It must be present. I like that. That's a nice one. It must be present. And we'll go ahead and we'll just go create our first new instance of it. So we'll just do console is equal to described class .new, and we don't have a name yet, so that will stay as it is. We'll say expect console to not be valid. So with Rails validations, right, we're testing validations. There's on any given model, you can do .valid, and that will check to see if it's valid based upon your validations. And with RSpec, as we covered in the past, since it's a Boolean method, we can just do to not be valid. And let's go ahead and run that test and see what happens. So it fails uninitialized constant console, and that's because we haven't actually created our class yet. So if we do class, we'll call this console, and it'll inherit from active record base. In Rails 5 and modern Rails, you might actually see this being called application record, similar to how there's application controller. But we don't have that yet, and we don't have multiple models, so maybe what we'll do is once we have our second model, if we ever do, then we'll go ahead and refactor that to the application record. But let's just do that to start. Run it again, it failed. And that's because it expected this object we created not to be valid, but it actually is valid. So what we'll do next is we'll do validate name presence true. And that will go ahead and make sure that name is present. Unknown key presence. Maybe I have a typo. Or does this need to be validates? There we go. So validate needs to be plural. I think if it was just validate, you would pass in a method name. That would be for your custom validations. And there's a great example of test-driven development helping us out because we caught a typo. So it must be present. And then what you could do is you could do console.name is equal to we, and then you could test it again and say, now expect that to be valid. So that's great. I tend to not like to have multiple expects in example groups, but I think it's nice when testing validations to see, okay, it's not valid, and okay, now it is valid. So there we go for a name, and then we'll also do manufacturer. We'll do the same thing, it must be present. We'll just go ahead and pull that down. We'll say describe class.new. So leave that as it is. We'll expect it to not be valid. We'll set the manufacturer to Nintendo. And we'll just say, let's expect it to be valid. We'll run it. So this fails because it says name can't be blank. And that's because we already have our name validation. So here we'll do name, and we'll do we. Save it and run it. Now we have the failure we expected, which is it expected this object to be not to be valid, but it actually is valid. That's because we don't have our validation yet. Copy and paste that, create it manufacturer, go ahead and run it again. So manufacturer must be present is working. Now name must be present is not working. And that's because we need to actually pass the manufacturer up here. And we'll just go ahead and do Nintendo. Go ahead and save it, run it again. Both pass, which is great. Now, writing and managing these validations can become a little tedious, right? Because here we're optionally saying that we're setting the manufacturer, but not the name. Here we're setting the name, but not the manufacturer. And some of this code's kind of similar. And you can actually find gems to help you test these validations. The popular one is called shoulda matchers, which you can use, and that's great. It allows you to do things like, you know, like name should be present or whatever the syntax is. I forget it off the top of my head, but shoulda matchers is pretty cool. Just so you have the name, it's shoulda matchers. Pretty sure that's a gem name. But for the sake of learning how to test this, let's keep it as it is. So a couple things we might be able to do to refactor this is I like to, as we did in the first episode, pull this out in a subject. And let's just create a common subject here of our Nintendo Wii. So we have our object, it's called subject. Then what I like to do is for this validation of the attribute we're testing, I like to set it to nil because we already set it above. We'll say expect it not to be valid. Or actually what we could do is we could do expect it to be valid, set it to nil, and then say it's not valid. And then this goes away. We'll expect it to be valid by default, set the manufacturer to nil, and then expect it to not be valid. So this is just simpler because we're not creating multiple instances of the console object in each test. We're just creating one and we're adjusting it to test it. So let's see what failed. Expect console. So I'm actually going to do a find and replace of console with subject. Go ahead and save that, run it again. Now it passes, and now we have those validations, which is cool. This isn't the kind of thing where you can go crazy with these validations. I like to just keep them simple and test that basic thing that drives out this validation. So there we have our validations. Now let's create a unit test. In a previous episode, I created a method called console full name, I think. Let me see if I can find that. It might not be, yeah, it might have just been, well, let me check. It's probably in test spec. Here we go, formatted name. So we actually have this class, this console class I created that is just a plain Ruby object. We'll make that a model in the future. But let's go ahead and make that formatted name. So if we do def, or we'll do describe, formatted name. Note that I put the hash mark there because we're actually testing a method, not just this concept of validates. We'll go ahead and say it returns the manufacturer and name string. Say expect subject formatted name to equal Nintendo Wii. So if we wanted to, somewhere in our code, which maybe we'll go ahead and update our request spec in the future to do that, if we ever wanted just a quick way to do formatted name, we'd use this method. Go ahead, run that again. It should fail because we don't have that method. Save it, run it again. Now we have the method, it fails, it just returns nil. Now we can go ahead and we can do manufacturer and then name. We actually don't need this @ sign. Great, so that passes, and there's a simple method. We could explore more complicated methods in the future, but I think this gives you the basic path of, okay, here we have this model, we created this instance of it, and then we're testing it. Now note, I use .new here instead of .create. Now if we do .create, run it again, it'll still work because the subject is still an instance of the console. It's just that when we call create, it gets saved to the database. And we actually don't need that saved to the database because we're just testing validations, which don't require persistence, unless yours do, but in our case, they don't. And then formatted name doesn't require that object to be saved to the database. So if you don't have to save it to the database, you shouldn't save it to the database in your tests because it's a little slower. It has to interact with the database, which is a nice little tip. But we're going to actually create some tests that do require data to be in the database. So we have our validations, our manufacturer, formatted name, Now let's go ahead and test a Rails scope. And I think validations, instance methods, and scopes cover quite a bit of what's in a Rails model. And what I want to do is I want to create a scope that lets us do something like console.nintendo that returns an array of consoles manufactured by Nintendo. So if you wanted to get all of Nintendo's consoles, you would just call console.nintendo. And it'll return those. So let's go ahead and write that test. Do describe. I do a period instead of a hash here because it's a class method, not an instance method. And that's a nice way to let other people who read your test code and yourself that, okay, this is where you're looking for a class method, not an instance method in this test code and in that class if you're ever changing or debugging it. So let's describe Nintendo. We'll say it returns an array, or it's really going to be an active record relation of consoles manufactured by Nintendo. All right, so we've got our example. Now we'll go ahead and we need to create some data for this. I'd like to do, I'm just gonna do a quick copy and paste here. If you're using something like Factory Girl, which again, it has a new name, I should look it up instead of just saying I don't know the name. But if you had Factory Girl or Fabrication, or you're using fixtures, you could use those to get this data, but we're just gonna go ahead and create them for the sake of keeping it simple and direct to not complicate this too much. And we'll go ahead and we'll just create a few different consoles. Create the Switch. And then let's create a PS4 or something, just to have a non-Nintendo console. Then what we'll do is we'll say expect describe class, which back from the first episode we have describe class because of this constant here of console. Say expect describe class dot Nintendo to equal, well, actually we do contain exactly, which also came from a previous episode, which is really nice, of Wii and Switch. So that's testing, okay, it doesn't contain PS4. And actually, we're not going to be using this PS4 variable, so we can actually just delete it and create that record by itself. Let's go ahead and run the test. So we have our test data set up, and we have our expectation. And it fails. It says undefined method Nintendo for our class. This is because we haven't actually defined the scope. So defining scope, you just type scope, the name of it. And I'm just going to save it and see what happens. Okay, wrong number of arguments, given 1, expected 2. That's because it needs the actual code of the, I forget the name of that. It's either a proc or, I call it stabby with curly braces, but I should learn the actual name of that, sorry. Run the test again, and we see expected the collection to contain Wii and our Switch object, but it actually contained Wii, PS4, and the Switch object. So the contain exactly has this nice, the extra elements were output that lets us know what was included that shouldn't have been. And this is because the scope is returning all of the consoles. So what we do is we do where manufacturer is Nintendo. Go ahead and save that. I'll run the test again. So I ran it. Actual collection contained an empty array. The missing elements were the actual objects we want. Let's see what's going on. Oh, I know what the problem is. I'm using uppercase and it's looking for lowercase. Change it, fix it. There we go. That's an example of the kind of bug where I would totally write that and then you might not catch that. So there we go. We have the scope, and we have this little model, this little console model, which is really quite nifty, right? We could even use it in, let's say, our other tests. Let's go ahead and refactor this. Now here, instead of creating just these hash objects, let's update this code to instead use our new model. I'm going to open the request spec that we wrote in the previous episode in this other pane so we can easily see it. And let's just run it really quick to see where things are at. So we do bin RSpec spec requests console spec, run it, and it passes. Now, instead of this being existing in our index and being returned, we're going to actually create that data in our spec requests, our request spec, and expect it to be returned. So what we'll do is we'll say, let's go ahead and put this in a before block at the top level of our test. So before every test, it's going to go ahead and it's going to create all this data. It's kind of like test database seed. Let's delete the array because we don't actually need the array. This becomes console.create. Console.create again. Just going to go ahead and change these quick. Now we might not need all this test data, right? We could simplify it to see that this is working, but let's just keep it as it is and keep it working. We'll keep consoles returning the name of it. Maybe we could even make it include the manufacturer. That would be kind of neat, but let's just keep that as it is. We create all our test data now in our test. I'll go ahead and I'll run it again with those changes. You know what? I didn't save this. Save that, run it again. And our test fails. Undefined method map for nil class. I'm guessing that other one fails for the same reason. Private method select called for nil class. Because here we don't have consoles set. Consoles is just set to nil. What we want to do is say consoles is equal to console.all, right? And you could do console.where or something like that. But for now, let's just do console.all. We'll run it again. Great, now it passes. And that's because it's fetching all these consoles from the database, and our old code still works because what console.all returns actually is enumerable, so it has select. We can actually do that. But now what we could do is we could actually use the pretzel syntax with select and just do... no, that's not what I wanted. I mean, in the map, we could do, instead of this map and passing console with console.name, name will actually exist as a method on console because we have a model. So we can actually just create, we can actually just call pretzel name. Run that again, it passes, so that change is good. Here is kind of interesting where it's checking manufacturer and it's mapping them. And there might be a way we could improve this code because we're working with active record, where instead of going through all of the consoles and then selecting them, we could actually use a different database query. So we'll just do a minor refactor here of if the params manufacturer is present, we'll actually do console.where manufacturer is equal to params manufacturer. And it might seem like, oh yeah, maybe we want to do console.nintendo or something like that. But honestly, that was more for an example where maybe you'd use that in a page, like a specific page on in your app or something. But for this, we'll stick with the where so that it's more general. run the tests again, make sure it passes. It does, which is great. And that's just a little more performant, where if console.all was returning hundreds of records or thousands of records, calling .select and looping through all of them to select certain ones would be quite slow, where this is only pulling from the database the ones that we need, which is pretty cool. One final change I'd like to make is, let's make use of that full name method. So we'll say, instead of containing just the console name, let's have it contain the formatted name. Except there we go. So we'll update that, and then we'll update this again. Say that contains only mechanical consoles. Run the tests. It fails because it's currently getting just the name, but we want the full formatted name. And here, since we created that formatted name, we can just do formatted_name. Run it. See what changed. It's saying that it expected it to contain, oh, I have a typo. There we go, Nintendo Switch, run it again. Great. Everything's passing. This index is a little bit, This index is a little bit simpler and a little bit nicer to work with. We've got we've got a request spec that tests it all. You could, like I said, you could create these in a different way, but let's just keep it as the normal active record creation for now. We've got our console model with a scope, validations, and a unit method, and we've got a couple of tests. Let's just read through these tests one more time, make sure there's not anything we could clean up or improve. I think this works for now. I hope that this was helpful. If you have any questions about testing models or specific methods or things that come along with active record that I didn't cover, feel free to reach out and ask, and I'd be happy to expand on any of it as much as I can. Thank you very much for watching.